find this exactly, but he talks about the hope in the body all the time.
Hmm.
Because he starts with a reflection on Matthew 19, which he goes all the way back to the beginning. But then at the same time, right, he's always refers to the eschatological dimension of man.
Hmm.
But he wouldn't have referred to the beginning and then the eschatological dimension if there actually wasn't something good still within man that
Right.
is actually then something that we have grounds also for hope.
Welcome to the Space Salvi Institute podcast. I'm Andrew Petiprin with Bobby Mixa. Bobby, how are you?
Good, Andrew. A lovely summer day here in Krakow. How's it in Texas?
It's okay. It's pretty hot, but not as hot as it sometimes is. But you're right. It's high summer in the Northern Hemisphere. And today we're going to roll up our sleeves, show a little skin, and talk about the body, or at any rate, the theology of the
Theology of the
body.
body. Yeah. Some of you may be a little disappointed because it's maybe not as steamy as Andrew is suggesting, but yes, we're going to get to work and delve into this.
Yeah, theology of the body. Now, there may be some of our listeners out there. I would expect many of our listeners have heard of St. John Paul II's theology of the body. Maybe they are really well versed in it, but there may be some of our listeners who have never really heard about it before. So, you have just finished teaching theology of the body this summer to students
That's
in
right.
Krakow. So, why don't you kick it off by just sharing with our listeners what theology of the body is?
Yeah. Well, in terms of teaching, I had this opportunity of the past 2 weeks to teach for the John Paul II project. It's a great program that's run by Joe and Corin McDonald. They started this after World Youth Day in Krakow. And so they asked me to teach the theology of the body, knowing my background from the John Paul II Institute, which in so many respects is kind of an elaboration of that. But, it was a chance for me to delve back into these texts. I actually have not gone over the Catechesis on Human Love, which is another name for the theology of the body, in a long time. But rereading it just opened up the treasure trove that is the theology of the body. And, I thought Weigel, when he was describing theology of the body in Witness to Hope as a ticking time bomb, I thought that was a
Hmm.
little too much hyperbole. But I see what he's getting at. And I think he is right that, in the third millennium, perhaps hopefully we get to start and delving into what John Paul II was trying to do in the theology of the body. And I use the term trying to do because I think he was actually paving a certain path beyond certain, let's say, the kind of modern fly trap that I've heard used before, trying to get beyond some of the trap that we're kind of oftentimes stuck in that makes it difficult for us to think about the human person and the body, to think about things like truth, the relation between truth and freedom, even just the sexual difference, man and women. So yeah, Andrew, this was a great chance to delve into it. I had the students read a ton, but just generally speaking, I mean, you asked me what is it? Um, well, John Paul II. I mean, this is maybe a little bit too much. I won't get into too much of a historical explanation of this, but if you look at the trajectory of John Paul II's career, even before he was Pope and when he was a philosophy professor, he was obsessed with an analysis of human love. You see that when he wrote his I think dissertation for theology, it was on the faith according to John of the Cross. But for John of the Cross, the nuptial dimension of the spiritual life is key. I mean, John of the Cross comes from that tradition in which the Song of the Songs is the height of Christian mysticism. And Song of the Songs is kind of a book of the Bible that I think at one point was considered, really considered whether or not they could bring it into the canon because it was so, if you want to say, erotic, and
Yeah,
merely about human love. Yeah.
right. And but well, but of course the medieval monks, they made much hay with
Oh
the Song
yeah.
of Songs, and just it was a kind of classic text for kind of allegorical readings of the scripture, right? Which I think points to what you were just saying about John of the Cross, right? I mean, it
Yeah.
sort of highlights this like essential relationship of the church and Christ as kind of, the
Bride,
body
groom,
of
groom.
Christ and the
Yeah.
bride and the bridegroom, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And when you read even the Gospels, particularly John, you just see that everywhere. And even the way, Paul thinks about things. But anyways, I mean, so John Paul II, Caro Wojtyła, was always kind of developing this. You could see with John of the Cross, and then he writes his habilitation on Max Shaler, who Max Shaler, became famous because of maybe his focus on these human experiences, particularly on human love. It was seen that Shaler, and he was liked by Catholic moral theologians or Catholic social tradition because they thought maybe he was bringing back an Augustinian tradition that really kind of focused on the restlessness of the human heart. Um, and so that he was very popular in the 1930s. But ultimately, John Paul II, while he appreciates Shaler and his focus on value, he says that Shaler's account can actually be grounds for a foundation for a Christian moral theology. But anyways, going on from Shaler, he starts to develop things even more. He writes Love and Responsibility. Um, and the council, during the time of the council, he is very much focused on the Gaudium et Spes, but also looking at it, particularly some sections in Gaudium et Spes. When you think about Gaudium et Spes 24, the gift of self and that kind of Trinitarian gift. There's just so much that John Paul II was developing. So I won't go through it all, but by the time he gets to theology of the body, which is he's starting to develop this in the late 70s, he's he's elected Pope. And so the theology of the body in a nutshell are 130 of these Wednesday catecheses that John Paul II gave, starting pretty much right from the beginning of his pontificacy, going ultimately, I think, maybe up to 1984. So I always imagine there was a little break though, because there was an assassination attempt,
Hmm.
and he was hit. So he just,
He was
unlike
indeed.
Trump,
Yeah.
yeah, couldn't get back right into the ring. But there's a little bit of a break there. But I always imagine and kind of laugh trying to imagine what these people who were listening to these Wednesday catechesis, what they were, what their reactions were, because um, anybody who delves through this will see it's actually quite difficult to get through. So, but my
Yeah.
students, I think, did.
Okay, I want to hear about your students' reaction in a second, and maybe also share a little
Yeah,
anecdote that I have. But let's pursue the origin a little deeper, because
yeah,
I think you and I both are comfortable with the term Christian humanist for
yeah,
ourselves and for our project, right?
yeah,
And we want to promote that. We really think that the study of man is a really good place to focus our attention with
yeah.
regard to God and the world, right?
Hmm.
And it seems to me, from what little I know about theology of the body, I mean, I know that it's often discussed in terms of like what the church thinks about contraception,
Yeah,
marriage, all these kinds of issues, right? But when we back it all up, it really is basically just asking the question, what is man,
yeah,
right? I
yeah,
mean, it really, like, what is man for? Why was man made? And you mentioned John of the Cross before. I mean, I know that a lot of people study theology of the body in relation to, for example, Thomas Aquinas too.
yeah,
But then there's also this whole stream of kind of the origin story of theology of the body that's rooted in people like Immanuel Kant, right? And
mhm,
this whole like personalism stuff. So I don't know.
yeah,
Can you say a little more about that? Because you're so much
yeah.
better on all that than I
Oh no,
am.
no, no. I was meaning to. I just realized I didn't say anything about Humanae Vitae. But
Oh
so to
yeah.
give a little bit of the context too, John Paul II developed this partially because he thought that this the background understanding that's necessary to appreciate a text like Humani Vitae, in which the conjugal act, the spousal act, is unitive and procreative, and they always go together. Um, that
And
was,
for our listeners who don't know what Humani Vitae is, that's
yes.
the very controversial encyclical from 1968 from
Hmm.
Pope St. Paul VI that essentially reaffirmed the church's traditional teaching against
Yeah,
contraception, right? I mean,
yeah,
affirming that, that sex was for the purpose of essentially, its primary purpose was for the procreation of children, and therefore, like, couples needed to be open to life all the time,
yeah.
is what we
And,
often hear.
I'm sure most people already know all the history of that and the controversy up to this day.
Hmm.
But he thought that, we really needed to delve into what does it mean to be a human being, but also since the human being is the apex of creation, what does it mean? What really what is nature? What is the world? What the mean in that, and wrapped in that is the meaning of the human body. And
Hmm.
so John Paul II, he does this, kind of goes back, and you don't really necessarily find this all elaborated in the text, but actually the introduction to this version, which is by Mikkel Waldstein, the introduction is really helpful if you want to get a background in what John Paul II is trying to address with getting into things like the modern philosophers like Kant, like Descartes, like Bacon. Um,
Hmm.
and so basically, John Paul II really appreciated Immanuel Kant. Many people will describe John Paul II as a personalist, and oftentimes personalism is associated with a figure like Immanuel Kant because Immanuel Kant always said that the human person or persons are particularly the human person, but a person is always an end in and of itself, never a mere means. So whenever you deal with a human person or just a person, you always have to treat them as an end, never as merely a means to
Hmm.
an end. So John Paul II also thought, though, Kant in some ways was operating in this modern world that necessarily didn't appreciate the moral law or the human body as having something like an ethos within itself. So he goes back to Descartes, and Descartes, who is in many respects continuing the project, the mechanical philosophy that you find in people like Francis Bacon, which the goal of this project isn't necessarily knowledge in some, he's going to talk about, conjugal knowledge, which in some ways you become united with the object. The subject and object become united, and there's this fruitfulness between the two of them. But the project is about acquiring power. And so there's the power over the objects, power over nature. Nature now is pure mechanism. You find this in Galileo in some ways in how he thinks about nature in terms of mathematics, but mathematics not in the ancient Greek sense is kind of like with the symbolism that's all implied in that, but
Hmm.
mathematics has kind of pure mechanical relations. So, anyways, if you want to put it in like a nutshell, John Paul II is doing this is why I think he's paving the way for us. He, in a
Hmm.
way, is trying to help us better see nature as having an inherent meaning that you find particularly in the human body, which has a spousal meaning. So he writes
Hmm.
all about the spousal meaning of the body. That's one of the first parts that he gets into.
Yeah, and so it seems to me, part of the project anyway is saying what the church is saying about the human body, about sexuality, about all these things isn't right. It isn't the old thing that we've talked about before, like, Catholicism is the best religion because we have the most rules or whatever. It isn't like the church is trying to say in a document like Humani Vitae, look, guys, I know you want to do all this stuff. And but you just can't because we say you can't.
Yeah.
That
No.
too bad, right? And John Paul II is trying to say no. Let's look at it from sort of this more holistic viewpoint, right?
Yeah.
Like what is it all for? And this leads me to ask you, so in the 21st century now, teaching young people about this, what is their reaction? Like even ones who are faithful Catholics, like
Yeah.
how do young people react when they're presented with this stuff?
Well, yeah, I mean, okay, first off on that, when you're saying this is not just a no, but it's for the
Right.
sake of our full flourishing. And there's a grammar to that. And so I would say the reaction is many of the students, even when I had to teach something like this in this group was particularly faithful, devout uh, group of Catholics. So I didn't really have to sell them this too much. But when I was teaching in a Catholic high school and, I had to go over a lot of the stuff and I was drawing stuff from the theology of the body, but I recognized, heck, we got to get into the kind of the basics to even make sense of Catholic sexual teaching. The students, even the ones who were fully immersed in the kind of the culture that would basically find this to be the most appalling, you know, thing around and the enemy, they in some ways it seemed like they recognized that
Hmm.
a kind of purely mechanical view of the body and this division between subject in some ways the subjectivity this if you want, he calls it this like new subjectivity of modernity um, where we're just these kind of conscious thinking things and that's in some ways the realm of value and meaning that being divorced from our bodies in the world it's not out there that but that's just kind of a pure mechanism that we can then analyze through science and all that there's something that I found in many of my young students, they were dissatisfied with that.
Hmm.
We've talked about this before, Andrew, how in some ways there's this like longing almost to have something like a sacramental cosmos
Yeah.
that's just, meaning in some ways. The whole everything is kind of imbued with meaning that ultimately has a transcendence to it. Um, and my students, I think, they were attracted to some things like the esoteric and the occult
Mm.
because they were I think moving in this direction of something like, what John Paul II refers to as the ethos of the body.
Mm.
So it's fascinating. And a lot of the students too, like I had a student this last year who was she always told me she's a Wiccan. I
Mm.
actually I really like this student. She was excellent history student, and but she was passionate about being a Wiccan. But the
Mm.
more she talked about what her like, you know, um, interest in Wiccan was about, was almost exactly this. She was dissatisfied with the kind of mechanical world,
Hmm.
and she wanted something more. Um, and so, anyways, our conversation, and also too, she was kind of a feminist, which she wanted to have like this recognition of actually like being an end in and of itself. And there was this suspicion of the sexual act that it's just love in the sexual act is actually impossible because you're
Hmm.
always just a means to another end. Um, and so, anyways, I find that John Paul II, you can do this in so many ways where you could just use purely secular terminology and present them with this vision, but without mentioning Catholicism at all, and
Yeah.
they'll find it attractive.
Yeah. Let me share a quick anecdote with you that strengthens even further the strong point you've already made. When I was still an Anglican before I was Catholic, 2 years in a row, I was asked by I was living in Nashville. I was an Episcopal priest, and I had a friend who he and his wife ran this group in Nashville. I assume it still exists. It was called the Nashville Fellows. And it was a group of Protestant young people who had, I think, either just graduated from college or who had maybe even taken a year out from college or whatever to spend a year living in Nashville, and they were all Protestant Christians. And most of them weren't even Anglicans; they were some other kind of Protestants. But it was this group called the Nashville Fellows, and they could go out into the city and they would be hooked up with some kind of like internship or something where they were being encouraged to like learn, like kind of dip their toes into something they might like to do later on in their life when they were kind of fully credentialed or whatever. But also doing it from the perspective of being a person of faith, right? Well, they also had to come along to these lectures every week and they had to like read certain books and kind of be formed a little bit in it. Well, the people who ran this group, they knew that I wasn't Catholic, but they knew that I was sort of Catholic curious. So they asked me if I would teach for these young people Christopher West's little book, Theology of the Body for Beginners, which I had never even read before. And I didn't even really know very much about theology of the body back then. But I read the book. I did it 2 years in a row. I read the book and I made up my notes or whatever, and I came and I taught the session, all Protestants. And now a lot of people, a lot of Catholics don't realize this, but I mean, things like birth control, for example. Birth control is 0% controversial for Protestants. I mean, it is ubiquitous. It is unquestioned, right? But we're talking through some of these things about contraception and marriage and like some of these issues, and the minds of these curious young Protestants, their minds were just blown because they had never considered these questions from this sort of larger kind of holistic philosophical uh, viewpoint before.
Yeah.
And so I think on this point, George Weigel is right that like it really does have this kind of the theology of the body does have this kind of ticking time bomb potential in it
Yeah.
as people either kind of accidentally like these students or maybe more intentionally from people who are, as you say, just out there in the world, especially young people, like wondering what their bodies are for, what life is for, kind of
Yeah.
looking out at all the weirdness and just wondering that just can't be right, and looking for answers somewhere else. They may very well find it in theology of the body.
Yeah. Going back to that, I think that um there's actually when you focus on these ordinary things. You don't think about, okay, let's think about, like the ontology that may be disclosed by thinking about the child or, you know,
Hmm.
um, actually thinking about maleness and femaleness that sometimes comes across as kind of quaint and sentimental. And you think, well, how can you get from that all the way to this grand, metaphysics of gift that John Paul II has going on in the background the whole
Hmm.
time? But it's there. I mean, and this is why it's a holistic approach. There's not some theory that then is imposed, but in some ways, the actual you find by focusing on the particular that and the particular what I mean by that in some of these just common experiences we all have as being human beings in the home, being born, that in some ways opens up something
Hmm.
that's just profound in its depths that says something about the nature of everything.
Yeah.
And so anyways, I think the key, though, too, when you present the theology of the body, is not to reduce it to just talking about sex.
Hmm.
And sometimes people will say, "Oh, the theology of the body is about relationships and it's about sexuality," which, yeah, that's part of that. But John Paul II's doing, and this is why I think George Weigel is right. He's doing something that includes that, but it's much much bigger than that.
Hmm.
This is why I think the people at the John Paul II Institute are doing a really like good thing. Some people critique the John Paul II Institute because students will show up and they'll be like, "Hey, I came to study the theology of the body or John Paul II's vision, and here you are talking about Ferdinand Ulrich and Homo abyssus, the metaphysics of the gift. What are you guys doing?" Um, anyways, but it's there. And so I
Yeah.
think John Paul II's approach is quite novel. I mean, I wouldn't say that it's like John Paul II is going to be some, great, like the next remembered as the next Thomas Aquinas or, Plato or Aristotle, but yet he's in some ways taking that tradition and
Hmm.
applying it for today. And it's just I think it's great. I mean, I almost was reading through this and I'm like, this is basically, like scriptural exegesis. He's going back to the
Hmm.
scriptures. This is a true catechesis. You get basically you can go through this and almost learn the faith by way of
Yeah.
focusing on human love. So it's quite profound. And right now the students who I taught, they're going to actually be teaching. They're going to be with a group of Ukrainian kids and teenagers, and they're actually taking some of the themes that they've learned in this class, and they're going to apply it to basic catechesis. And
Hmm.
so they never really thought about, okay, God's creation and covenant, and then Yahweh and Israel, and then Christ, the bridegroom, bride, and then the consummation of the wedding feast of the Lamb. And then they read Paul and the great mystery as the mystery is kind of the hidden in some ways. It's almost the strategy God has for the entirety of his creation is finding its completion in something
Hmm.
like the relation between Christ and his church. It's something that I think for the students, they said at the end of the class that this actually, in a way, shed a new light on the faith.
Yeah.
So I mean, this does so much. I mean, he opens up at the end something on the sacraments, talking about the nuptial dimension of the sacraments, particularly the Eucharist in terms of the gift of self,
Hmm.
baptism in terms of the washing of the bride. So it's quite profound.
Yeah, it's interesting how it seems so well suited to be incorporated into, as you've said, just basic catechesis. And I think that there are people doing this. I think that there are people who are interested in kind of trying to integrate theology of the body into just like children's faith formation. For example, maybe other applications as well. Before we move on, can you say something just really briefly once more about about the metaphysics of gift? Because that's
Yeah,
something that I think is so important. And
yeah.
and it's really not that complicated. And it's one of those things when you sort of hear somebody talk about it, you think, wow, that's incredible. So could you just say something about that?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so I don't know if people can see in the back. There's so many books. But
Yeah.
Homo Abyssus, Metaphysics of the Gift. Guy Ferdinand Ulrich. He was a famous German, well, not so famous, German Catholic philosopher who was very much interested in thinking. He was thinking of addressing Heidegger and Hegel. So, if you want to say the best of modern philosophy in the Germans,
Hmm.
and those two figures, and their focus particularly on the impossibility in some of them of something like a metaphysics. But this kind of return to the question of being. But what he wanted to do, and he brought Thomas Aquinas into this dialogue. So Thomas Aquinas defines God, right, as ipsum esse non subsistens, right? But then creation is that which subsists, but in some ways is radically at the end of the day nothing. Okay,
Hmm.
so the way he thinks about being, that being that is not God, but esse commune. But then this gets pretty complicated. I'm not going to get into all of this, but God gives of himself, okay?
Right.
And yet there's something other than God, but yet totally like God, nothing in and of itself. And yet
Hmm.
within that gift, it in some ways is always in reference to the giver.
Right.
But that's not in some ways a violent relationship. Okay,
Right.
so this is where you get some of the stuff like the John Paul II talks about like the hermeneutics of suspicion, where there's always this kind of, I mean, I don't think he's referring to this particularly in terms of like French philosophy, but there's always this suspicion that, if there's the gift, then there inevitably is something owed. But God completely being full in and of himself without needing anything
Right.
allows but then creation is only in itself, okay, fully itself in relation to God. So there's a lot of this that, and I probably did a lot of injustice to Ferdinand Ulrich, but if people want to look at this, there's actually a lot. John Paul II Institute, a lot of D.L. Schindler, the deceased D.L. Schindler,
Hmm.
not D.C. Schindler, who's still alive.
Yeah.
It was developing a lot of this stuff. So it's giving an account of being as creation.
Yeah, and I mean, even just boiled down to just, I don't know, maybe the very simplest way of thinking about it in terms of like our discussion about humanity is just like, I mean, we're a gift. Our lives are a gift. Our bodies are
Everything's
gifts.
good.
Everything's a gift. Everything.
Yes.
And when you change your mindset to remember that, then you see the world differently. It's
Yeah.
and you can then I think a lot of people talk about kind of having a relationship with God and that sort of thing. That and I always found as an evangelical that language kind of rang a little bit hollow to me. I didn't
Yeah.
understand what that meant. As a sacramental Christian, I do. I mean, as a Catholic, like I understand like taking Christ's body, blood, soul, and divinity into my body, right? But even this wider concept that my relationship with God is that he gave me, and he's
Yeah.
he's the giver, right? There's something profound about that.
And you're good. I mean, like
Right.
you look at it's interesting. I think it was St. Augustine who said on his little book on catechesis, the first thing you should let the catechumen know is that they should really focus on God loved them first.
Yep.
So this kind of this idea, but God loved them first, but that's even in the very entirety of who they are has been affirmed. And so
Right.
there is something transformative about that. And how you see, I mean, as you see creation as gift, you also recognize that it's not for the sake of mere possession, for the
Right.
sake of use. So John Paul II, when he does this, like focusing on the dimension of gift, um, that opens up so much. I mean, so there you have it, where it's like, okay, there's the church's approach to how do we how do we approach the world? How do we
Hmm.
approach others? Et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Yeah, and some of those questions are some of the famous ones that people know about from theology of the body: contraception,
Yeah.
marriage, all of those kinds of issues, and those are really important. And it's great that that's a place to find clarity on those things. It should be said, though, and maybe we can transition to some other topics, that John Paul II, of course, was himself an artist. I mean, he was involved in the theater. He was a playwright. He had a keen sensitivity for the power of art. And there are some implications to our, how shall I say, appreciation, I guess, or our engagement with art that's to be found in theology of the body. Could you say
Yeah.
some more about that?
Yeah, actually, so this was something that when I was rereading this, I don't think I focused on this the first time around and several other times, but there's an appendix, okay, I think it's at the very end of the first section, which he talks about the ethos of the body in art and media. And so a lot of this is actually kind of a little bit abstract, even for me, and I like the abstract. But John Paul II, it's interesting how he talks about the different ways of presenting the body, particularly through the visual arts. And so I encourage everybody, I mean, to go to this section. It's actually the catechesis number 60. And he devoted how many weeks to this, but several weeks to this question. And he he's incredibly interested in the body being presented as an object, but an object for the sake of a kind of in the realm of aesthetics.
Hmm.
But how do you present the body in its nakedness, particularly, as not being merely an object,
Hmm.
um, and but also there being conveyed something of the subjectivity, the personhood of the other within the way it's presented. The interesting thing is he's not against nakedness in and of itself, but yet, and everybody knows John Paul II, right? You know, had no problem with nakedness in the Sistine Chapel. Um, but um, actually, he has a lot of, I think, and some I don't think this is maybe articulated, even in his own mind, but he's working through this. Like, okay, in today's world where we have the phenomenon of mass culture, which photography and cinema,
Hmm.
he's concerned, and he talks about this, the body actually being presented as something like an anonymous object. And I
Yeah.
think I think partially what he has in mind here too is something like advertising, where you can just take any face and just put it up there, and it's
Hmm.
just a means for spending. So what I actually did is I had the students when we were covering this section, I had them not read, watch Roger Scruton's BBC
Hmm.
documentary on
I was just
beauty.
thinking of him as you were talking. Yeah.
Yeah, because there's actually, I think, and Roger Scruton's interesting like this. Roger Scruton doesn't talk in the same terms that John Paul II does, but when John Paul II like talks about, the concupiscence of the eyes, Roger Scruton has a whole section in there about about that, the difference
Hmm.
between pornography or
Yeah.
like porno vision, the way of seeing the naked body, as opposed to beholding it as kind of
Hmm.
an object of wonder
Yeah.
and appreciate.
Appreciation,
Yeah,
wonder. Yeah. Yeah.
exactly. But it's hard because, sometimes people think, oh, well, we can get beyond the realm of concupiscence. But John Paul II is always clear. Even though we are, in the redeemed man, we're never completely beyond that. So
Yeah.
it's interesting though. I mean, I see that he in some ways like painting and sculpture, he seems to he doesn't focus on that too much, but his concern, it seems to be, is photography and cinema.
Hmm.
So anyways, I have to delve into that a little bit more here, and I have so much highlighted like I usually do. It's hard to pinpoint some things that he says.
Yeah, I mean, that is a really interesting question, and I want to look at all of that myself. But it does occur to me, right, that a painting or a piece of sculpture, even of the most kind of mannerist, realist representation of the subject that is like being depicted, is still a step removed from the actual flesh of the person. And
Yeah,
with photography, and even more so with cinema, I mean, you really are looking at the real thing. Now, of course, that's debatable. I mean, especially when you're thinking about something like pornography. I mean, like what is real about that? Nothing. I mean, right
yeah,
down to the body parts, right? I mean, they're sort of these, surgically constructed creatures to some degree, right? Um, but it's an interesting consideration that, the body um has it can have kind of more or less mystery
yeah,
depending on kind of your levels of remove from it. And that's really the thing that Scruton talks about so brilliantly too, is this idea of um that the mystery is in this beholding and appreciating. But something like pornography, or indeed something like advertising, as you said before, or some AI generated, you know
yeah,
um animation sequence, it has none of that. It has no, in a sense, like Scruton even might say, it has no soul.
yeah.
And that's really ultimately what we're getting at here with the theology of the body, is that we are embodied souls,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. It's interesting because with when he talks about like painting and sculpture, the artist, contributes to the presentation. And so there's kind of the throughout always the kind of the human domain, even the object, the I mean, when you think about painting and sculpture, the body has to be there. You have to in some ways contemplate the body, and and you just can't take a quick snap of it. um and and also there's in sculpture and in painting, there's in some ways it seems to be like a transcendence within that, because the way that the body is disclosed, that it could, you think of like an idol referring to itself, but in painting and sculpture could also have, I mean, you got to be careful here, a certain like transcendent dimension where it points beyond itself.
Yeah.
Um, but also, it just seems to me that and you see this in different style. And I actually had the students watch Terrence Malick movie because I wanted them to see different ways of actually filming the human body. Either in the respect that appreciates the dignity of it, or
Hmm.
in some ways focuses in, and you kind of have that almost concupiscent look
Hmm.
as the body is depicted. I think Terrence Malick really is the way that the cinematography, the way they do it is fascinating.
Hmm.
So I think that even in advertising, I mean, you just want to have like a pretty face, or maybe you want to have a recognizable face, but it's always for the sake of something else. Um,
Hmm.
and you think about John Paul II too, when with being an actor, and you think John Paul, people always talk about John Paul II's command of himself. And even when he writes person and act, it's always about self-possession,
Hmm.
where you have that, and only in self possession can you give yourself, according to John Paul II.
Hmm.
Um, and you think that, so an actor is somebody who in some ways can possess himself or herself so completely, um, that
Yeah.
then they make a work of art of themselves on the stage.
Yeah.
But it's something a little bit different when you're just merely kind of this object that's there for everybody to
Yeah.
to look at.
Yeah, and I would have loved to know, I don't think he wrote about this, but I would have loved to know John Paul II's thoughts about the specific question of the face in cinema,
Yeah,
because I think like, and there we might
the
bring
Levinas
in,
stuff. Yeah,
yeah, Levinas, who was a great philosopher that John Paul II admired, because there we see, there's certain realist directors who get this so well. I mean, certainly Malick does, but people like the Dardenne brothers in Belgium, and plenty of kind of kind of the realist cinema of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, that it's all about the face, and so those movies might have nudity in them here and there,
yeah,
whatever, I don't know. But I mean, ultimately, and I guess the question is outstanding, like whether that's, appropriate for your particular temperament, whether you ought to watch a particular movie that may have that in it. But what those things are not is pornographic. Now, I
yeah,
mean, some of them are like, something like Bertolucci's Last Tango in Paris, which is to me just kind of an unwatchable movie, whereas his movie Stealing Beauty that he made in the 90s is absolutely beautiful. And a lot of it has to do with the face, in my opinion, right?
yeah.
So I don't know, just a thought, but
Do you think
something,
about many of these? What's his name? Who did Andrei Rublev,
yeah, yeah,
um, the
yeah,
Russian
yeah,
filmmaker?
Tchaikovsky,
Yeah, I
Andrei
mean,
Tchaikovsky.
the way that I mean, the contemplation of the face in these
Hmm.
movies, you really can see the way that they film these people. They're not objects, but there's you want to say the human dimension
Yeah,
that
that's absolutely right.
comes through
Yeah.
completely.
Yeah, and talk about the human dignity. I mean, I think that's a place where cinema really has a place to excel as an art form in the depiction of that.
That's right. Yeah.
Let's talk about technology a little bit, unless you want to talk some more about art.
No, no, yeah.
Because I think that this is another area where the theology of the body may prove prophetic.
Yeah.
Here we are now in kind of the AI age, and a lot of what you were talking about before with regard to even going back to these kind of early modern philosophers, the problems that in some respects their inquiries have raised have not been solved and have only gotten worse, right? By the fact that we're not grounded in the right metaphysics or the right understanding of the human person. Let me read you this quote. The other day, we both saw this, I think. Mark Zuckerberg, who is the famous CEO of Facebook, a tech mogul, if there ever was such a thing, and therefore kind of one of the chief representatives of an industry that seems to be operating without regard to whether they should do things, but just because they can do things. And he said this. I'm going to read this to you and get your reaction, maybe with your theology of the body perspective. He said to this interviewer, there's a bunch of people in the tech community who think, oh, we'll just like separate out our consciousness and intelligence and like upload it to the cloud. And I'm like, that just sounds ridiculous to me. I mean, to me, it's like, I think part of what makes you a person is you like are active. You have energy. Like we're not just minds, right? I think the energy and the love and all those things are probably as foundational to what makes you a person. Now, note he doesn't use the word body there, but he's heading in the right direction, it seems like, right? And not just thinking in these kind of Gnostic technocratic terms about like consciousness is all that matters.
Yeah.
So what do you think about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, be careful. John Paul II, I think he uses the term neo-Manichaeanism
Mm,
as ascended in modernity, and just want to be careful, like, it might not just be a repeat of Manichaeanism and all its complexity, but yeah, I mean, John Paul II, it's interesting the application for the theology of the body to technology. Somebody who's really doing this well is DC Schindler. And I think
mm,
he actually might be writing a book on this right now. At least the theology of the body as it applies to thinking about work and technology. He has a class called Dominion and Techne. I was lucky to
mm,
take that class. I took the first offering of that class. So I was the first, group of students in that class, and it was amazing. And he doesn't, I think, use the theology of the body on that. But remember, the theology of the body is a contemplation of the beginning chapters of Genesis, And so when we think about man's relation to, to have dominion, but also to till the garden, how we interpret the word dominion is incredibly important, to rule. But the what's implied here is always working with what the thing is.
Hmm.
And um, if you're operating where it is just mechanism, there is nothing to contemplate, nothing to see in the thing as to work with it, then it is just basically just mere material stuff or standing reserve for you to do whatever with. So that's where,
Hmm.
you have people like Heidegger who kind of sees where he has the essay concerning technology.
Right.
And in many respects, I think John Paul II would be appreciative of that, where it's like basically modernity in some ways just sees the world as standing reserve. And the way of coming to, I wouldn't even say know the world and even use the term know it, but is just the point is to have power over it. And so
Hmm.
technology is just basically various new means uh, that are there. And since everything is just basically possibility, that
Hmm.
you're just opening up new avenues of possibility. So this makes sense of so many things. Like you wouldn't have the transgenderism if it wasn't because of this kind of technological way of viewing things. And now
Right.
we just have these new techniques that can make these things
Right.
possible.
Yeah. I mean, we
And
literally can do it. I mean, like
yeah,
in previous centuries, they couldn't, right? Yeah.
yeah. So there's nothing there. I mean, there's no such thing as what are you talking about? The language of the body. What are you talking about?
Right.
The goodness of maleness and femaleness. Um, anyway, so this is something that's really important now, but also, when we get to things like um, artificial intelligence, these various technologies that are coming out, I think the theology of the body is going to continue to have so much relevance in how Catholics ought to be thinking about these things. Um, it's yeah, incredibly relevant.
Don't you think, embedded in this too is a correction, I think, to people's default um, wrong eschatology?
Yeah,
Because I mean, even Christians might, they might think about technology or something, and they might think like, well, what is the big deal? I mean, I'm just a soul. I mean, so what is the big deal if yeah, I mean, that's like what my hope is that I'm just going to be kind of uploaded to heaven someday or whatever, right? But real Christian eschatology says, no, no, you will be a body. You will be resurrected, right? And you're going to live in some kind of physical reality forever,
yeah,
you know? And so, yeah, you aren't just, you're not just going to trade one simulacrum for another, where it sort of just seems like an experience that you're just having in your mind. But I mean, you're really having it because you're real, right?
yeah. And not only that, I mean, it seems to me that if you go into the history, you mentioned this eschatological dimension and building if you want to talk about like building the heavenly Jerusalem, if you look at somebody
Hmm.
even like Francis Bacon and whether or not, um, these early modern figures were truly honest and sincere in their Christianity, but they saw this new methodology, which was really grounded in technique, as in some ways being the tool for re-Edenizing the cosmos. But
Right.
it had to be where man in some ways subjects nature completely as an object to itself. There's no in some ways working with nature in tune with the cosmos. I mean, there's nothing like that
Hmm.
in it. So I mean, somebody's really good on this trajectory. If people want to take a look at it, is Remy Bragg.
Yeah.
The shift from, if you want to say a ancient medieval um, cosmos to what we have in his book, literally on the modern project. Um,
Hmm.
man's what's it called? Man, the kingdom of man,
Yeah.
the project of modernity, or something like that. I take a look at that to see that as kind of the context in which John Paul II is operating.
Yeah. Another great place to point people to is C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man, which
Absolutely.
is, I think, sort of page for page, kind of the best distilled and most accessible articulation of this concern that I've ever encountered.
Yeah. I mean, I think the Abolition of Man, I'm sure John Paul II read it, but somebody who was really, really influential in John Paul II's papacy, and I think maybe had a hand in Veritatis Splendor, which is one of the great texts. You'll find so many themes outlined in Theology of the Body being articulated in Veritatis Splendor, which is, I believe, his great encyclical on moral theology. Um, Robert Spemann, the
Hmm.
great German philosopher who read Abolition of Man and said, in that book was articulated just this entirely new world for me. It was the answer. It was in that book.
Yeah.
Um, and so, anyways, but what's interesting is that Spemann, before reading Abolition of Man, was reading Adorno and Horkheimer's Dialectics of the Enlightenment. And he said there's actually some similarity to them, but C.S. Lewis presents it in a much healthier way. Um,
Hmm.
so this is what I was saying, that actually some of my students who might actually have been might be interested in something like the Dialectics of the Enlightenment, something like the postmodern critique of the Enlightenment, et cetera, actually might find something in John Paul II that they can appreciate.
Yeah, and maybe, in consonance with the name of our project, Spe Salvi, I mean, something hopeful too, right?
Yeah,
Um, because it's not uh the solution is a rediscovery
yeah.
of this sort of divinely revealed nature, right?
Yeah, I mean, I have to find this exactly, but he talks about the hope in the body all the time.
Hmm.
Because he starts with a reflection on Matthew 19, which he goes all the way back to the beginning. But then at the same time, right, he's always refers to the eschatological dimension of man.
Hmm.
But he wouldn't have referred to the beginning and then the eschatological dimension if there actually wasn't something good still within man that
Right.
is actually then something that we have grounds also for hope today.
Hmm.
So, I mean, John Paul II, right? Famously, you have the title of the George Weigel's book, Witness to Hope. But in
Hmm.
so many respects, John Paul II's whole project is to represent that Christian hope to the world. And in the case of theology of the body, you find that actually that so many of the issues that people who fall into despair because of becoming mere sexual means to the end of consumptive pleasure or whatever, um, actually there is a way beyond that, but by reflecting on the dynamics that already are there within the body.
Yeah. Well, that might be as good a place as any to stop, unless you have any final reflections that you want to share
No,
about theology of the body.
I just encourage everybody to take a look at this. I mean the text is profound. If somebody wants to, I don't know if I have it in front of me here. Um, but Michael Waldstein has dedicated a lot. I think he's done. Michael Waldstein's a professor. I think he's at Steubenville right now. But he has dedicated a lot to articulating this vision of the theology of the body, and I think he does it in a really good manner. But he has a new
Hmm.
book, and I thought I had it in front of me here, but I can't find it. It's called The Glory. I believe it's called the Logos. I don't know. I'll post it up somewhere, but it's this huge fat book on, I think it's the
Yeah.
glory of the logos, etc. But it gives you, he has all these essays that will help you better understand the theology of the body. But then at the same time, he has an outline of all these Wednesday catecheses, and he kind of summarizes what each of them are about. So if you're reading the theology of the body, John Paul II's actual text, and you see John Paul II's pretty repetitive, it's nice to have Michael Waldstein on hand to see, well, what is John Paul II actually doing? Because there's a reason
Mm.
for his repetition. He's going somewhere, but Michael Waldstein, he articulates the logic that you might not see in the
Mm.
actual text themselves. In addition to that, I want people like go on Communio's website. The
Hmm.
Theology of the Body and Communio, this great journal. The many of the teachers at the Communio at the John Paul II Institute in DC are also board members and writers and editors for the Communio, which was founded by the greats like Hans von Balthasar, de Lubac. Our viewers, I know they know these greats.
Hmm.
And John Paul II actually, because in communism, you can only print so much um, for like church publications. John Paul II got rid of something so that they could then print Communio in Polish. And so actually so much of John Paul II was very close to Henri de Lubac. He was
Hmm.
actually writing to de Lubac a lot. He articulates we see that he sees a need to write person and act. He wrote that in a letter to de Lubac. But Communio and the thinkers, particularly in the North American edition, are in some ways behind all of their articles are things that relate to the theology of the body. So
Yeah.
if you're wondering what is theology of the body or this metaphysics of gift, what does that have to do with money? You'll have it related to everything. I mean, G.K. Chesterton says what like one of the best lines is, "How can you take something like the liturgy and compare it to the octopus or something?" I'm probably not getting it right, but the man who can connect the two has a great vision there.
Yeah.
So John Paul II's vision, the integral vision of man, is there and will connect everything to this. So I encourage you to dive deep into the theology of the body and therefore to prove George Weigel's prophecy right.
Hmm. That's great stuff, Bobby. And that just about wraps it up. So, to any of our viewers and listeners, please do go ahead and check out those recommendations that Bobby has just made. Share this podcast with others if you'd like them to hear this great conversation that you've just listened to. Rate us, review us, check us out at spacesalviinstitute.com and sign up for our emails. And until next time, God bless and live in hope.